I'm really excited to be presenting this information really for the first time to a larger audience of our Greenway study. So this project would not have been possible without some of our major funders for this project. I see one of them in this room. Hi, Deb. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. The New York State Energy Research and Development Authority is another major funder of this project. If you're here from NYC, please raise your hand, as well as many other generous funders. So thank you all for helping make this possible. We're really excited to be at this point with this project. So I think for next slide, looks like it's taking a little while to load, but Brooklyn Greenway Initiative started this project about 5 years ago. And we were focused on answering these core questions, which are appearing on the screen. Brooklyn Greenway Initiative, as many of you may know, is a 20-year-old nonprofit that was started by people in Brooklyn who wanted a waterfront greenway. They wanted access to the greenway. They wanted safe walking, cycling infrastructure to visit friends, go to other communities, just have fun, get some exercise. All the things that the commissioner was just talking about, why we're all here to support greenways. And we are aware that greenways cross jurisdictions. They, as we've been discussing for the past couple of days, they're on DOT rights of way, they're within parks, they're part of EDC projects on waterfronts, and so on and so forth. And so we wanted kind of an integrated look at information about the asset that we were started to advance, the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, and then hopefully make this relevant to greenway efforts across the city. So for all of you from other neighborhoods, the coalition didn't exist at that time, but I'm very excited that it does and that we can share this at the summit and at the coalition. So kind of answering some of these core questions: who uses the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway? Why do they use it? How does the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway affect carbon emissions? That was a core question for NYC. How can the results support the advocacy of the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway? And how does this serve as a model for other future studies? Next slide. So now that we're in 2024, the year of greenways, we are very cognizant about how this information can affect sort of short-term, implementation of plans that were created long ago, and also affect all of the planning that we've been discussing over the past few days. Planning for the early action corridor, including the North Shore of Staten Island, which we'll be visiting in a little while. The other green lines on this map, and 4 or 3 other boroughs. The citywide greenways plan, which the city is working on, to be scheduled to be ready by the end of this year. The Blueways plan that Andrew Kimball referred to yesterday. How do we, kind of work with greenways and bike lanes to kind of get fewer big trucks off our streets and enable more transportation through cargo bikes and micromobility. And then also, we can keep going. Also looking at, the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, all the different projects that are underway along this 29-mile waterfront area, the entire waterfront of Brooklyn, some of which we have discussed previously in this conversation. So lots of work at various points of this waterfront greenway, and certainly we think of relevance to communities across New York City. So next slide. Okay, great. I think I'd like to introduce Ellis with the Regional Plan Association, who has been working on this project, I think, since the beginning for 5 years. So thanks, Ellis.
Thanks, Hunter. So yeah, I'm excited to get into to talk about the study and the findings. But first, to give you a little bit more information about what went into the study. So this study involves 3 big data collection efforts. The first was installing Numina sensors, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, that allowed us to get continuous counts along the Greenway. It's able to distinguish between pedestrians and cyclists, and give us a little bit more detail than like traditional sensors. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. We collected over 1,000 intercept surveys along the Greenway at different points. And that allowed us to collect more detailed information on things like why people are using it, demographic information, things like that. We weighted those results, the survey data by the counts that we were able to get from the sensors. And finally, an online research panel that was administered by Qualtrics that allowed us to get even more detailed information on sort of general use of the Greenway. And crucially, it allows us to also survey non-users and ask them questions about why they aren't using the Greenway. And go to the next slide. So to give you some information on how the Numina sensors work, and Tara from Numina will be on the panel, can give you more information. But essentially, they're able to measure different objects in the field of view, identify bikes, pedestrians, cars, things like that, without identifying any personal information. And then also trace paths through the field of view, so you can look for patterns, things like how, where people are within the right of way, things like that. And as I mentioned, it preserves privacy because it doesn't actually record like video of people. It just records such objects within space essentially. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a map of where the location of the sensors and intercept circular locations are. We tried to make it as even as possible throughout the greenways. You can see it's a little sparser towards the southern end, which kind of leads to the next slide. Since we wanted this study to serve as a model for future studies, we also want to be transparent about some of the challenges that we face. One of the things that we didn't expect is that it took 2 years to get the sensors installed. And we had some difficulty finding kind of the right light poles in certain areas. They had to be a certain type of light pole. So that was a little bit of a limitation. There's some data gaps from things like utility or technical issues, including one light pole that was actually hit by a car in the middle of the data collection. And then just because of like budget constraints, we weren't able to kind of address all of these issues as they came up. But if we go to the next slide, that said, we got an amazing amount of data, really rich data sets that I'm excited to get into some of those findings now. So just kind of a basic question about how many people are using the Greenway. We're not able to say exactly, like totally straightforward. We can say that the sensors picked up on an average of 23,000 cyclists, 36,000 pedestrians every day. Because of the location of those sensors, and they're not, recording individual people, that is probably counting multiple, or the same people multiple times. But even at the most conservative, it's at least 7,000 cyclists and 21,000 pedestrians, but likely a lot more than that. And as you can see also, this if we go back real quick, we can see that the counts also picked up things like the 5-hour bike tour that starts spike in May 2022. Go to the next slide. So I mean, one of the kind of highlights of the findings for me is just how it shows just how vital an asset the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway is to the city. One of the clear examples of that is about 75% of users use it at least a few times a week, which I think is even surprising to us about how often people who use it like to use it. Go to the next slide. Another surprising thing, we were able to take this data and compare it with weather data and see how different weather conditions affected Greenway use. And even in like terrible weather, so that includes like measurable rain and snow, temperatures below freezing or above 90 degrees, or even like the wildfire smoke that we saw last year. Even under those conditions, most people still use the Greenway. They still bike, they still walk. And so it's surprising that even though weather conditions do affect how many people use it, not as much as certainly at least I would have expected, which also highlights just how important it is. Next slide. So getting into like how are people, why are people using the Greenway? What are they using it for? Overall, the vast majority of people are using for recreation. The main difference between how pedestrians use it and cyclists use it is really just kind of the amount of people who use it for commuting. Cyclists are more likely to be using it for commuting. Even though it's only a kind of small percentage here on the chart in terms of people who answered they're using it to meet friends and family. We also found using during the survey that 36% of users were actually accompanied by friends or family at the time. So it's like it shows how vital the kind of community gathering space it is as well. And we can go to the next slide. Another important thing that we found in looking at the data is just how different the different uses and patterns we saw depending on which part of the greenway we're looking at. You know, this is 29-mile greenway that goes through all different kinds of neighborhoods and has different sort of contexts and design. So that really affects how people are using it. So for example, Jamaica Bay Greenway, like 90% of people are using for recreation, and in places like Williamsburg, it's much more integrated with the kind of city streets. There's more people using it for commuting, closer to job centers, things like that, using it for errands. And so that kind of, we can go to the next slide, led us to sort of identify 8 different segments of the Greenway, each with their kind of own unique context. So you have places, integrated into the street grid, like Williamsburg, Greenpoint, or Navy Yard and Dumbo. You have these areas that are off the street and protected going through parks, like Jamaica Bay Greenway, Shore Greenway. You have areas that are like some areas that are more complete than others, which also affects how people are using it. You can go to the next slide. We can see how, start to see how these differences, affect usage. And there's some similarities to places that are more integrated in the street grid up in Williamsburg and Dumbo, have a lot more users generally. But some interesting, comparisons. If you look at the Shore Parkway Greenway and the Jamaica Bay Greenway, both parts of the Greenway that go through parks. In one, you have a higher proportion of pedestrians in the Shore Parkway Greenway, whereas Jamaica Bay Greenway, the cyclists outnumber pedestrians quite a bit. So just some interesting differences there. Similarities. Again, people are using it for recreation, whether it's exercise, fun, for specific social purposes, and even at its lowest, it's still about 2/3, even at the kind of lowest part, red up. Next slide. So to kind of get to the question of carbon emissions, this was a little bit more difficult to answer than we initially anticipated, but some ways that we kind of can look at that is how this affects things like commuting and types of trips that people might be taking cars or even public transit. How are they using Greenway and walking or biking instead? So commuting, is high for cyclists. It's around 30% in near Bridge Park and Williamsburg Greenway, which are closer to a lot of job centers, and where the Greenway is largely complete. According to the survey, 40% of people who were using the Greenway for commuting would not have biked or walked without the Greenway. And 85% of them were using it at least a few times a week. So that's a lot of people who are using, that comes out to at least several thousand people using the Greenway for commuting instead of other types of transportation. All right, next slide. It's also we found that the Greenway is also pretty crucial for connecting to transit. Even though overall it's a relatively small percentage of trips, around 20% or so, of people who are using it to connect to transit. It's when asked the online survey generally, do you use the Greenway to connect to transit? Like, in general, 85% of people said that they did. So even though most trips aren't necessarily connected to transit, most people who use the Greenway have used it to connect to transit at some point. I also want to highlight particularly how important the greenways is to connecting to the ferry at certain locations, close to ferry stops, which is pretty interesting. Okay, next slide. So for the last few slides, kind of keeping in mind, how can we use this data to keep improving not just the Brooklyn Greenway, but how can we use it to improve greenway planning and design going forward. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of demographic information. Overall, with gender, greenway users are pretty equally likely to be male and female. But if you break it out by pedestrians and cyclists, that is not the case. 2/3 of cyclists on the greenway likely were male. This is in line with a lot of in general the gender gap with cycling, but still an area for improvement. And that, if you go to the next slide, this rich data set allows us to dive a bit deeper, so we can also look at how the gender gap varies from different locations, and look again, and also by the different types of purpose. So cyclists were more likely to be female if they were running errands or meeting friends and family than things like commuting or exercise. Next slide. In terms of race and ethnicity, in general, the racial demographics of greenway users reflect the neighborhoods surrounding the greenway. In most cases, there are a couple of exceptions, like for example, the Sunset Park area. And it's interesting that those exceptions also kind of correspond to areas where the greenway has kind of the most left to be developed, where it's less complete. It's hard to say exactly if that's a coincidence, correlation, or cost and effect. Interesting data points to know. Next slide. And then speaking of completing the greenway, so this chart here shows the relative volume of cyclists from kind of north to south on the greenway. And we can see where the red bars are, those are the sections where there were sensors where the greenway is not yet complete. And we can see that corresponds to some of the least used portions of the greenway for cyclists. Highlighting the importance of completing the greenway. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we were able to survey non-users as well. One interesting point from that is, when asked like why don't you use the greenway? By far the biggest answer was that they didn't know where it is. And so that highlights how much there may be for just raising awareness and getting people to understand where the greenway is and what it is. And then next slide. Finally, there's a lot. This is a ton of data. We didn't have time. We collected a lot of information that weren't able to analyze yet, and a lot of that is kind of the more detailed information on how people are using the greenway in specific locations, things like how people are using the right of way, how many bikes are on in the bike lanes versus the road or sidewalk, how many are turning at various points to stay on the greenway versus things like that. There's a lot of potential future research to just using the data set that we've already collected that would have implications for how we plan and build greenways. So I think with that, finish the slides. I guess we can bring that across.
And while everyone's coming up, I'll just mention that we know we just went through a lot of information. Some of the data that Ellis just presented is on posters, scattered throughout this room, so you can kind of look at it at your own leisure. The next step for this project is we are creating a report with analysis and also sort of neighborhood by neighborhood, sort of drilling down on information. So that will be a report that will be published in the next couple of weeks. We're putting the finishing touches on that. Obviously, we have a tremendous amount of information on the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway that we're very excited to share, and we're working on communicating that in a clear and cohesive way. So I'll just introduce our panelists and our moderator, and then we'll kick things off. So our moderator today is Elijah Hutchinson, the Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and a Greenpoint native, Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway user, cyclist, and Brooklyn Greenway Initiative board member. To my left is Pham, the CEO of Numina, one of the partners in this project. Ted Wright, the head of the Bike and Pedestrian Unit at New York City Department of Transportation, and of course, Ellis. Oh, you've got one, great. I'll turn this off.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Alright.
I don't know if they can.
Oh, no, we can't.
No. Hello, hello,
You have to push the button, I think. Right.
hello, hello.
Is this one?
Does this one work? Okay, great.
Um,
Well, first, thank you so much for the presentation. I think that was a lot of really useful information, and I'm sure you're all thinking about what it means for the things that you all care about. But I wanted to take a moment to zoom out a little bit and talk about the partnerships that exist behind this work. And this is a unique collaboration between a technology partner, governments, planners, policy people, community-based organizations. Why this partnership and how did it come together?
I am a little bit inclined to jump in because I think Ellis and I are sort of last man standing for the original crew that set this up. So I feel so lucky to have gotten to work with Terry Carta, who is Hunter's predecessor at BGI. I think she saw that the Greenway had been literally decades in the making, was still not quite complete, and that data was a thing that could really catalyze excitement and understanding of the importance of the Greenway and sort of where to prioritize resources to complete it. So it must have been as early as 2018, maybe it was 2019, we installed one sensor outside of the Maple Cemetery landscape that provided a sort of unique kind of controlled environment to test our technology and produce some really, really actionable information just about like how to operate that space and visitorship to a very specific gated environment, which is, you know, the entrance to that little park area. And yeah, from there, I think we realized like, cool, this could scale across the entire Greenway and that there really has never been a Greenway user study of this nature. So we could do something new that brought a lot of attention both to this Greenway and overall helps the cause of greenways. You know, that would be great. It also kind of opened this opportunity to get a pretty significant amount of funding from NYC, which has a transportation innovation kind of strategy in terms of their goal is to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions through many different kind of channels and strategies. And so we were able to not just say like, hey, this is a project that's going to produce a useful thing, but also it kind of fits into your agenda of funding innovation because we're going to actually develop a novel methodology and test, you know, kind of locally born and bred technology in that process as well. And then, yeah, I think when it comes to the planning, maybe Ellis is going to share how it came together, how this sort of is working now.
And so you can turn off your mic in case of feedback.
Push the button.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I think the partnership was really crucial. Like we couldn't have happened like this without the this sort of combination of partners. You know, without Numina, like you know, not just like providing technology, but also being a partner and making this happen was really crucial. And DOT being a partner, you know, even though it took a long time to get the sensors installed, I think without DOT as an active partner on this, it probably would not have happened at all. So I think, you know, we were able to do something that we wouldn't have been able to do if it was any just one of our organizations.
Maybe one more thought on that as well is that greenways are inherently like very interdisciplinary. So, you know, I forget the exact stat, but I think the Greenway crosses something like 16 different jurisdictional authorities. So we have, you know, city land, state land, lots of private property, you know, different parks and bids and all kinds of groups. So I think it was also really important that we had a bunch of different kinds of organizations that brought different skills and relationships. And like that informed for us, for example, having a really diverse technical advisory committee in terms of just like all the backgrounds and sort of opinions that got to inform how we ultimately designed and implemented the study as well.
Great, thank you. And related to that, DOT already collects a lot of information about the Greenway itself and its users, and this gets integrated into its planning. What is the value and what is novel and new about the information and data that's we're learning about today? And what's either novel about the approach of this study or novel about the information which resulted from the study?
I'll speak to that. Now, can you guys hear me? All right. We collect a lot of information, spend a lot of money on it, and we send out people that hold counters. You've probably seen them on the street. That has been happening since back when I started. We used to go out and just count. What we're talking about today is video sensor technology. It's very exciting. I don't know if you guys caught the video up there, the Numina video, but some of this stuff, what we're tracking, actually how people use things, is completely going to change the game. We have automatic counters right now that are loop detectors that can pick up bikes. They can't really pick up heads, and they can't really pick up the difference between micromobility and such, or other aspects of micromobility. We'll even get into all that. But the key here is as the population grows, and believe me, it really, really has. Like those numbers that I actually think they're probably a little bit higher in certain cases. Like I've seen Kent Avenue numbers as high as 5,000, 6,000 without the 5-foot light tour. It was hilarious. But the idea here is that we have to start experimenting with these things. That's very innovative. And Numina has brought something to the game that's a lot of fun to play with. We're still trying to figure out how it does. I would also like to point out though, a lot of the stuff that you talked about was just a straight up intercept survey. You know, and that's very expensive, time consuming, and it's also something that like is useful to us. And it costs money. We're talking about resources, like Commissioner was talking about it for a while. And like, I think we have to think about that. How do we use these things? And we'll get into that further. But those are the two things that really stick out to me that are special. So,
Yeah. Just to add to, I think a little bit to what Ted is saying. I mean, one, it's always expensive. Like, you know, if we had unlimited resources, I'm sure DOT would want to have like every kind of sensor in every corner. What we saw actually, having had that one sensor outside the Naval Cemetery landscape pre-pandemic, is we saw through the pandemic also, of course, like more bicyclists, the ridership patterns changing, like more people working remote or having different work schedules. I think so much of transportation planning happens around counting at peak times. And there's almost this assumption of like, we need to accommodate for peak traffic, peak volumes. And we sort of don't care, like all the other times, we're just gonna infer what that is. And sometimes we don't know. And I think now, just with the change in transportation patterns overall, something that is nice about like 24/7 monitoring and being able to, for example, differentiate by mode is as the peaks are maybe not as high, but sort of more distributed throughout the day, we're getting a way more accurate picture of like utility of these amenities and this infrastructure. And like, for example, in the pandemic, not so much in New York City, we deployed in 50 other cities, but like in other cities, you could tell who were the sort of critical workers because the people who were still out walking to the bus stop, those are people that are, you know, we're working through the pandemic. And so I think this data also has the ability to highlight some of the equity issues that come with like transportation access and the fact that we're measuring all the time. We're not just measuring rush hour and people going to, you know, an office job or school. We get like a much richer picture of how these really serve so many different types of people in the city.
I'll just cap that off. I think Ted and Tara really summed it up well. I'm just especially excited about the integration of kind of just hardcore quantitative data from the counters, as well as that sort of social data, and how you know, RPA as our partner has really integrated that information to help us show kind of a bigger picture of, you know, really a dozen plus locations where we had intercept surveys and counters. So that's really amazing. And I'll also mention, Ellis alluded to this earlier, how the sensor locations kind of differ by community. And when we created this project, I think there was a decision that we wanted to position the sensors at sort of points of interest, or sorry, points of decision and points of entrance. And so actually, if we can pull up the map of the Greenway, that would be great. You know, where the Greenway is located within Parkland along Shore Parkway and Jamaica Bay Greenway, there are just fewer entrances to the Greenway. And so that affected, of course, how we were able to collect information, and of course, how the Greenway is being used, which you'll see when you see the report, how we, you know, have this very much more granular information about each community. So I think that's worth pointing out.
Thanks. And you know, DOT is always growing its toolkit and expanding the kinds and types of greenways in which we're building. We have this new data set that's now available, and it's really creating this feedback loop of data informed infrastructure that we can use to improve greenway design and perhaps even more importantly, improve maintenance. So how are you thinking about this information being useful for actually designing or maintaining greenways, either ones that exist now or potential future greenways?
I can start with that one. I think, and then I'd love to hear from Ted and our DOT partner. You know, I think you mentioned Kent Avenue earlier. Now we have social information. We have 24/7 counts differentiated with pedestrians and cyclists for Kent Avenue, which is certainly one of the most heavily used sections and most densely developed sections of the Greenway. And has, you know, the development of the Greenway has tracked the development of Kent Avenue. It looks quite different 20 years ago, as some of us know. And so, you know, as advocates, Brooklyn Greenway Initiative and our partners, we're asking for, you know, kind of more formalization and expansion of the Greenway in kind of that core part of Kent Avenue. Right now, for some of you who are familiar with it, it is heavily used, as I keep saying, lots of pedestrian traffic. And you know, it's kind of the first wave, I think, of DOT Greenway. It's green paint, and I'm not even sure if the plastic sticks are there. So it's just sort of marking it on the pavement. But you know, we of course would like to see this formalized. We'd like to see it expanded, and we'd like to see it protected. So that's kind of one example of, I think, where, you know, as advocates, we can put this information. We now have the data to tell that story, to make the argument for infrastructure improvements.
I mean, it definitely gives you a picture of how the Greenway is used and how, you know, parks and DOT have different, just keep it to these main owners of the Greenway. They have different core values. And we need to make sure that these values align. I'm biased, but in a transportation sort of way. I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of what Hunter's talking about, in the fact that you have a possibility here. you start to see the possibility with all the demographics. And how people are using it, some of that stuff that you saw out there from the study. I think almost in a more interesting way, for me, as somebody who's a bureaucrat, is like, these are hard problems to solve. When they said 2 years to put, how many sensors?
32 for the study.
32 sensors, and I didn't laugh when somebody said a pole got knocked down by a car, because that's facts. Like that, I have to go walking around the city, and when there's a signal down, I send something on my phone and somebody comes and fixes it. That's how the city, that, no, and actually signals get fixed in like about an hour. If you ever just put in one, emergency response, I don't know how you guys get to it, but a 311 request, as soon as the city is notified, that's a legal court case that needs to be solved. So now, we're talking about putting up things on street poles. There, I'll make a joke about the city moving slow. I appreciate a good joke. However, the problem is these are real boundaries to getting work done. And we do have to really look at the maintenance question and stop talking about it big and start to think about how the solutions are. Because right now we got a problem. We're building these things, you have different core groups trying to get what they have to do. Parks has to make sure that the park works. They have to make sure that they fix whatever hole is on the greenway. That's wonderful. We have to make sure that people keep moving on a road. If you ever look at DOT's website, what they tell car drivers, you know, those people. And we reroute them and we spend time on that, and that's time and effort. All those things take time, and it's a really big problem. So as people start to move in here, yes, we can identify some of the stuff that we see in the study. We can see that the user groups are growing, that it's more than just some fringe cyclist out there or joggers out there running that they're recreational people. Who cares? Maybe like that's my natural bias on transportation, sorry. But like, I do feel like we have to really face that problem. I don't know what the study gets us. I think the problems with the study show you more of where Elijah and I are sitting when somebody says, we get a correspondence letter that's very well written about what we have to do to make sure maintenance is better, but then what do we do about it? That's funding. There's still dictating, look it up, Leventhal memorandum. Look that up. That's a bureaucratic piece that everybody should know about. It's the worst document ever, but it still dictates. You know what it says? Parks is responsible for trees and parks. DOT is responsible for people moving anywhere where sidewalk and roadway. It's like literally 2 pages long. But it's very interesting. It's like 1980, maybe Lindsay administration, I'm pretty sure. Sorry, I'm gonna stop talking.
If I can jump in on that, because I think I'm sort of the token tech person on the panel, which is actually very unusual for me. I do think that there is an opportunity with sensors. I'm actually usually the last person to say sensors are the solution, because most of our problems actually aren't solved in this world are not lack of technology problems. They're like human and policy and process problems. But in this case, I actually do think that technology offers some interesting opportunities. As Ted noted, this is just a study. So this was, boxed to about 13 months. We have data where we're learning things. If this were made permanent, we could be using some of this data to predict more O&M things. So then you could say, oh, the sections that get 30% more use should actually be cleaned 30% more often. Or we're seeing that people pass this very specific entrance, and that trash can needs to be like changed. The bag trash needs to be collected and changed more often. Predicting, even things we are in a waterfront. So actually one of the challenges in this study, funny enough, we have a parallel study with MTA measuring bus lanes, and the uptime for those sensors was basically 100% through the study. Because they're mostly like more inland. On this study, we had a lot of interesting uptime challenges because this infrastructure is water facing, it is beaten by wind and rain and, cars hitting light poles and stuff like that. But if these were, for example, used to detect like when there are flooding incidents, like these are really tactical, just operations and maintenance things that like technology can help us scale. Like as Ted said, these are not just big problems because like they're big conceptually in a lot of ways. It's also like literal distance. This is almost 30 miles. So we're not going to have humans walking that whole distance every day, looking at every little thing. That's actually a place that technology can help us a lot.
I'll just add, really sorry for going down that whole 11 ball around it, bringing it down. The city is actually going to be installing these things. We are looking at vision sensors. We're spending a lot of money analyzing it, figuring out how we're going to use these to do a predictive model of where people are riding. This is huge stuff that the city is investing a lot of hardcore energy into, and this is one of the initial steps. So it's interesting to see. But definitely, what I'm saying, I don't want it to be interpreted that we're scared of the technology or moving backwards because of all those things. We're going to be leaning into this. It's the way to do it. We don't want to send people out anymore, and loop detectors don't work for the complications that are out there on the street.
Thanks for that. I want to add too, as the other fellow bureaucrat on the panel, that it's not just Parks, DOT, and EDC that also are the only decision makers within the Greenway design. Using East Midtown Greenway as an example, you have to justify every inch of how wide the bike paths are and how much you can cover the water to state and federal agencies. And so while we have our preferences for what we would like to see, it's state DOT, it's Federal Highway Administration, it's Coast Guard, it's Army Corps, who are setting up the rules and regulations, and this information to me can maybe be helpful in making some of those cases, which are sometimes clearer to us on the ground when we're in the city about what we really need, but not always clear to our state and federal partners who are approving our designs and approving our permits to actually build these projects.
Ellis, could you put up there's something really exciting here that I think you're talking, that slide that has the percentage of people, how they're traveling through the site.
Oh, yeah, that's the
Last slide.
last one.
What's interesting, that one right there, like when we were doing before, there's something, bicycle LOS, level service analysis. It's a very rudimentary, it's basically just a calculation based on vehicular level of service. Now, what we're starting to see is a little bit more of like, with this kind of data, we start to be able to rationalize exactly how wide a width has to be. How do we deal with comfort from a design side? And that's the part where the sensors come in really, really helpful, because we're no longer just talking about whether or not there's how many bikes are in a certain amount of width. We're talking about how many bikes traveling at what speed versus pedestrians. There's a little bit more of a nuance here that allows us to have a conversation about width that I think is definitely evolving since East Midtown Greenway. But it's really kind of exciting. And I'll also just say this, that like, as we look towards more shared streets, like what the commission was talking about on Broadway, like we have to also determine in these very complex environments, 34th Ave in Queens, like what are the things, we've seen actually there's another way of looking at this where you look at conflicts. So instead of showing just the numbers, you can kind of see it on another slide, but forget it. That like, how close do people get to cars? How close do people get to other people? Broadway is kind of slow moving. It's not a fast place for bikes, but if we were to do that shared street, like right out here in front of the MTA building and between the MTA building and Bowling Green Station, be a different story. And so, some of the stuff that happens on the Staten Island Ferry exit, like these are hard things, and we're starting to get more nuanced, and this is really kind of cool stuff to be able to go back, have a computer interpret what are the conflicts on the street, so we can get percentages like this and show us what, why we need a lot wider width, or why we need to slow down bikes for pedestrians.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when you were working out those designs with the design team and the engineers at AECOM at the time. You know, we called the place that's planted is called the utility corridor, because that's what can get approved through FHWA and state DOT, and we have to, you know, you had the it's used for transportation, but it's also clearly being used for recreation. And it's a social activity. A lot of greenway users are not on the greenway by themselves. And so how do we accommodate all of those users and conflicts and tensions? This is exactly the thing we have to prove as well to the regulators. I wanted to ask too, we saw a very different usage profile between different parts of Brooklyn, whether it was people using it mostly for commuting or people using it mostly for recreation, northern Brooklyn and southern Brooklyn. How do you think that this information starts to inform the strategy for what we would like to see in the development and build out of the Brooklyn Green? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I think, you know, to use the example that I gave with Kent earlier, I think it's really nice for us to have this data. We can demonstrate this. We can, you know, that happens to be an area where there's a very sympathetic elected official. Maybe that's an understatement for Lincoln, but I think in other areas we may need to make more of a case for build out and for infrastructure and for resources and maintenance. And I think, you know, having this sort of neighborhood by neighborhood level analysis is going to be really critical for us. And I'm really excited to be discussing this today with people from across New York City. And I think a real priority for me and for Brooklyn Greenway Initiative after the summit is to take this information to the people of Brooklyn and the policymakers of Brooklyn and really, you know, the people who use this greenway and really start to, like, you know, get their feedback, shape out a strategy. And, you know, from a political perspective, from an awareness raising perspective, we have information, you know, that Ellis presented. You know, people don't even know what the greenway is. They're probably using it, but you know, some of these issues came up yesterday with sort of wayfinding and just knowledge about the greenway system. So yeah, and so a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I see connecting back to the points that Commissioner Rodriguez was making up top about there's true equity gaps, and here you can see that real gender and racial difference between different segments of the greenway and its connection to where the gaps are and the quality and state of the greenway. So
I'm gonna throw in, like, it really, what I see out of the data is if you build it, they'll come. This has nothing to do with race, to tell you the honest truth. The real equity thing is if you have it by your house. You know, I'm referring to this map up here. I forget how it's saying, sorry, around Canarsie Pier, which is about 40%. That's the demographic in Canarsie Pier. That's it. So, like, what does that prove? I'm constantly going up against being like white people ride bikes. What about other people? And to me, I see that data very, very progressive.
And just one more question, and then we're gonna go to Q&A from the audience. Looking to the future, what are some ways that you're thinking about this data set and how it could be useful? Have you started to think about potential applications, possibilities of scaling up new types of information that you might want to collect, even if you didn't get a chance to collect it?
Start or?
Sure. Yeah, I think my answer is pretty short. I don't think I have this has been an amazing project that, you know, took years longer. Yeah, years longer than we anticipated. I think it was supposed to be done under previous administration, but of our organization. But I'm happy to be carrying the mantle forward and, you know, paying for it, et cetera. But anyway, but I think, you know, super excited about, I feel like we've just done sort of like the first swipe of this. And I think there's a lot of narratives that we can tell in sort of future types of analysis about the recreational users that Ted was talking about earlier, like those are people who are improving their health by using the Greenway. Obviously, the commissioner mentioned that earlier. And so I think there's a whole public health analysis that we could take, potentially, economic development. There are other kind of stories that we can tell with this data. The whole urban design discussion, on the slide behind us. So I think those are on the horizon with capacity and ability. And if folks have ideas for partners or ways to do this, I'm very open to discussing that afterwards.
There are so many good questions, so I think we should go to
Okay.
questions. Just looking at these. And not that we'll have answers, so maybe we can go through some of these quickly. But do you know whether your Brooklyn Greenway data is representative of greenways more generally? Is this what we would expect to find outside of Brooklyn?
I'm gonna lean into the last thing I said, that it literally follows the demographic around it. It's simple. People use parks around their house, they use greenways around their houses. And I think that it's really strong point that it's not like everybody can ride a bike. This doesn't have to be, sorry, I'm gonna say one more thing that I forgot about the gender gap. That gender gap is way higher for women on the Greenway. What does that tell me? That if you actually build separated paths, more people come. You have less of a natural bias about it. So that's what's kind of cool about the greenways, is by actually creating wide paths that feel like recreation, that feel safe, everybody's gonna use it. I don't see anything in there that stands out.
Okay, we're gonna do rapid fire answers and questions. No, this is great. Has anyone had any success getting mobile phone data to use for greenway planting? There's Apple and Google has to have a ton of stuff about our cell phones traveling around the city.
It sounds like Ellis is saying he doesn't have anything to say about that. And actually, I don't know if Ted does. I will say just something about our technology we didn't get into a lot in this panel, but we are completely privacy by design. That is sort of where we pioneered in this industry. Yes, we're using video, but we don't collect any personally identifiable information. And over the journey of developing this product and working with governments all over, we do a lot of education about privacy. Cell phone data is sort of frowned upon from like a privacy advocate's perspective these days. But at a very functional level, like if you don't care about personal privacy, the issue is that it's not very accurate when it comes to road estimation. So, in a lot of these places, a bike is moving much faster than a car. And most of the companies that do this sort of like device-based crowdsourced data, they're looking at car. Actually, most of their data is actually from cars connecting. They don't have very good multimodal accuracy. And so, and they don't necessarily ground truth their data very thoroughly. So they're not using a lot of like sensor companies to do that. So I think that is the value of having like real human or mechanical boots on the ground, like measuring mode share.
And we didn't get into this too much, but this question is related to how greenways can be shared and the multitude of users who use greenways and how it can actually help with pedestrian safety or people in wheelchairs or other mobility devices. How did the data set account for different users and how could it help inform increasing access to other users in a more inclusive way?
Yeah, so over the several years that it took to get the permits from DOT and then to actually conduct this study, the product actually improved a lot. So we actually increased the number of modes and the different things that our product can measure. So we detect and differentiate bicycles, pedestrians, cars, buses, and trucks, sort of high level vehicle classifications. But then we added motorbikes, which in this time included like motorcycles and more like rebel style moped kind of scooters. We do not differentiate e-bikes. We get a lot of requests for understanding kind of more accessibility metrics. So wheelchairs, white cane users. In most places other than New York City, those are such low incidence kind of like small populations and sort of low incidence in front of sensors that it's hard to say we're going to collect that data and not be able to track individuals. Like if you live in a neighborhood with one person in a wheelchair and you see a wheelchair in the data, you're like basically tracking your neighbor. So we aren't doing that just for that reason. But I think something that all planners at this point kind of know and we should remember is like when we plan for sort of the least abled or the most like challenged travelers, we are making streets better for everyone. And so I think still looking, you know, the intercept surveys are obviously super valuable. Sounds like Ellis will say more on that, but
Yeah, just real quick, yeah, the intercept surveys, we were able to collect data on things like you know, people with strollers or wheelchairs are using different types of you know, mobility devices. Do they have dogs with them? All those kinds of things are included in the intercept survey data.
And one final question, even though there's so many business that questions here. Is this information going to be publicly available, or how can other people continue to find out about this and what you learned?
Yes, the data will be released with the report. So yeah, it will be available for people to see, you know, working with other people, see how they use it.
And one quick comment on like the partnership aspect and sort of some of the other innovations in this project. We got a first of its kind permit to do this from DOT, and with that, we included a data sharing agreement that we actually adapted from something that we also did with the city of Boston, where we are allowed to share the data with anyone. So this is, you know, the data that will be shared through the white paper is likely going to be pretty pre-synthesized. But like there's a lot of raw data that you can get from us, just like any of us here have access to it. Numina can provide it at like extremely high granularity. And one of the things I think we dreamed of is like whether these sensors, you know, continue to be deployed and collect data across the city, even in just the data set we have, there's so much information about at the urban design, like street level. This should be informing like basic design typologies and things that can go into future greenways, like in a very real data-driven way. So if anyone wants to pick up that project, I think it's something we've been excited about and would love to have like either gotten into in a second phase of this study or could be really supportive of the, you know, current greenways expansion that we're seeing.
Yeah, I'm particularly excited about using this information for our environmental justice work out of even our office. So, you know, happy to talk more too about our next phase of plan and work and how we can incorporate your findings. Thank you so much, everybody, for the panel. I really appreciate it.